Well, don't forget the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.
Sound off like you got a pair. Sir, yes, sir.
Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit.
We talk about vexations to the spirit. I've got a guy here in studio, folks, who knows exactly what that means. Thanks to me. Folks, welcome back to the second in Ronin Radio suite of programs. Today, June 15th, 2014, is Father's Day. I hope if you haven't already, you've reached out to your dad. Let him know. Thank him for putting up with you, for raising you. I, on the other hand, did something maybe not that I would recommend. I'm making my dad work on Father's Day. He's joining me here in the studio on Daily Mail. Dad, welcome to my radio show.
Thank you, Ben. It's a real honor to be here, and I must say a delight to be your father, along with your two brothers. It's always been a great honor for me.
Okay, see, when you get me all choked up and you know, weepy, it's not a good way to start the show.
That's so I can do all the talking.
Okay, there you go. Vexation. I have always believed for a long time that your life did not begin until I was born. That may not be an accurate statement, but I think sometimes as children, maybe we tend to be self-centered. But you go, you know, introduction, you actually were raised in a, and hopefully we'll focus on that quite a bit today when we talk about fathers and men in particular. You were raised in a different time, in a unique situation, growing up on a farm during the Depression, surrounded by hardworking men because they had to work hard or you didn't eat.
That's absolutely correct. Sometimes when I look back, Ben, it seems amazing to me how different not only life but the entire world was then. And in addition to all the differences about economy and the social structures, to me I think the most significant difference and the thing that had most impact directly on my formation was how different families seemed to be. Families were, I think, much more bonded. Part of that was of necessity. In order to survive, you had to work closely together. And I grew up with tremendous admiration for not only my father, but my mother as well. They were both very strong people in quite different ways. My dad was a very egregious kind of person, well known and recognized throughout that area, seen as a leader. My mother, while she socialized well with other individuals, she was much, I would say, a pretty shy person, but nevertheless a very strong person.
So that's where I get it.
I think you and I. But I just, as a young person, I admired them so much, and I always marveled at how grown up they were. I always thought, how does anyone get that grown up? Well, when you become a father or a parent yourself, then you begin learning how that happens. A lot of that happens because you do become a parent, and one of the questions or one of the issues that you face almost immediately when you become a parent is, most of us do that at a time in life when we are relatively youthful. Mm-hmm. Then when you become a parent, it becomes clear to you that you need to do a lot more growing. At first I found that kind of, very challenging and even a little bit frightening. But then after I got into it, I began realizing how exciting it was that, I kind of had the idea, I think which a lot of people do, that when you reach the age of maturity, which at that time was 21 years, that then you were grown up. Well, Of course, I found out you're not really. I mean, you're partly grown up, but you've got a lot more growing to do. And just having your own children was a tremendous contribution to that, because when your oldest brother was born, I began thinking about that, and I began realizing, it's not just about me anymore, or even about me and your mother. Now there's another life here, and there's something very sacred about that, and it carries a lot of responsibility. And that's when I began realizing I needed to become more of an adult, like I had admired in my parents and my grandparents.
One of the favorite stories of mine that you've told me about your dad, my grandfather, and this, we're talking South Dakota, where the snow drifts. In fact, I remember there would be doors on the second story with no stairs, because sometimes the drifts would be so high that's the only way you could get out. But one of my favorite stories was he'd gone, I think, to pick you and your brothers and sisters up from school or someplace, and you're literally sort of fighting your way back to the farm with these big, huge draft horses. But the snow got so deep that these draft horses couldn't even cut through it. So your dad was out there knocking the snow down in front of the horses to get his kids back to the safety of the farm.
That's true. Usually the school was all these one-room schoolhouses, and that was a mile south of our farmstead. And generally we walked until my dad bought a little Shetland pony and a two-wheel rubber-tired cart, and then we rode in style back and forth. But in the winter, during blizzard times, my dad would come with the team of horses in a box wagon. That was a wagon that had high sides and back to haul loads of grain in. And so we could huddle in the bottom of the wagon, and we had these, what we call buffalo robes, that we'd huddle in. And, it would get, in the wintertime, it got dark very early. So by the time we got out of school, it was getting dark, and some places the drift were literally so high the horses could not break through. A horse, in order to break through like a snowdrift, the horse has to be able to lift its leg up high enough to be able to step down on the snow. Well, when it got so deep, they couldn't do that anymore. They just stopped. And my dad would get out of the wagon. He would go in front. It was a team of horses, 2 horses. He would go in front of each of the horses, and he personally would break a path through the snow, either until we got to that drift or far enough that then he'd come back and drive the horses up until he'd have to go out and break another path. And I just, to this day, I can feel the awe I felt when I saw my dad do that, just how incredible the strength and the courage and the determination of that man to do that kind of thing. But that was typical of the spirit of those pioneer people. They really were pioneer people, because we kind of lived at that time pretty much on the edge, close to the edge of what had been settled in the prairies of South Dakota.
Now, introducing it, we're getting ready to go to break. Introducing the next segment, Dad, one thing you and I have talked about over time is just how that, I don't know if it's technology or society, but maybe it's the media, how the perception of fathers and fatherhood has sort of been, I'll just say it, I think it's been denigrated. Fathers have not become the supportive, the learning, the figure you aspire to and you learn from, but to some extent they become the guy that is the butt of the jokes.
Right, and that's one thing I find very, very painful, although I think, it's all right to be made fun of. If you're strong, you can be the butt of jokes. But I'm glad to see that beginning to change now, and maybe we could mention a few of those things while we go into our next segment. Okay, folks, this is your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia. I'm joined on Father's Day by my dad. I'm making my dad work on Father's Day. And hey, you know what? My dad is cool. He Facebooks, he texts a long ways from a one-room schoolhouse in South Dakota. I'll tell you what, I won't take credit for that. He can take credit for me or the blame, whatever you like. We're live in studio. If you have a question or comment, feel free to give us a call, 751-1041. We'll be right back.
games. Oh, Silent Jim spoke. Wow, it is quite a day. Folks, is your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia. Welcome back to Daily Mail. It's Father's Day. If you haven't already, and I know you have because American Warrior Daily Mail listeners are very smart and very conscientious, but just in case, make sure you let your dad know how much you appreciate him, how much you love him today. Send him a text, phone call. In my case, I invited my dad into work. So joining me for Daily Mail, Bill Buehler, my father. Welcome back. You were commenting about how fast it goes. It zips right by, doesn't it?
Thank you, Ben.
One thing you talk about earlier on about how literally you, even growing up, like in your case, where you had great examples of strong men, of strong fathers, it wasn't until you became a father, literally for the first time with my oldest brother Mike, that there was just a change in your life and your way of thinking. So Dad, what is the role? How do you learn to be a father, or do you kind of just learn as you go, or what?
There's another number of elements that contribute to that. In my own case, and I think in the case of a lot of people, the very best thing is to have a good father yourself to learn from. There's a phrase in the book of Proverbs that says, iron sharpens iron. And of course the idea, it's basically the idea of mentoring, that you learn how really to become a person or a good person, or to grow up or develop simply by living with someone who's already done that. And in my case, I was blessed not only with a very good father, but a good grandfather. One of my favorite memories of my grandfather is after he and my grandmother had retired, they moved to a nearby town, but he'd come every week. He'd come out to visit my uncle at his farm, and then he'd drive on to our farm and visit us. And of course, we were delighted because he usually brought candies, which was pretty rare for us in that time. But more importantly, he would play with us. He had a delightful, cheerful spirit, and he would play with my two brothers and me. And in the farmstead, the buildings are sort of arranged usually around a yard, and in our case, the well, all farms almost invariably had a well to provide water with a windmill that pumped the water, and that would be pumped into a large round wooden stock tank. And I remember this one day. It was just a blistering hot day in July, and he and I don't know how it got started, but he and I, my brothers, wound up at the stock tank, and the water, because it came from deep in the earth, was quite cool. Mm-hmm. And we got involved in a water fight. And we were just having a great, jolly good time, and he was just like a little kid, laughing, and we were making quite a noise. And all of a sudden, my mother came out of our house, and she started scolding him in German. We spoke mostly German in our home at that time, and my brothers and I were just absolutely stunned. I mean, we were absolutely amazed that our mother would do something like that she'd scold her father-in-law in German. And he was just like a little kid. I mean, he kind of ducked his head, and he was really quiet, and we were just all stunned looking at him and at our mother. And eventually, and I don't really know why she scolded him. I think it was just because she thought that was beneath his dignity to act like that. And then she went back in the home, and he kind of looked at us, and all of a sudden he started giggling. And away we went again, in our water fight. And from that, I learned really that even as a very mature adult, and he was a very dignified, he always dressed in suits and a hat, and he was a very dignified person. But I learned that no matter how grown up you could get, you could keep the joy of the child within you. You could keep the joy of life. And that's something I carried into becoming a father. I always enjoyed so much. It makes me sad when I hear parents talk about how terrible it is to be a parent and how awfully hard work it is and all the difficulties of it. And for me, it was always I'm not saying there weren't hard, difficult times. Of course there were.
With my other brothers, not with me.
Mostly with your other, but by the time you came along, you learned from their mistakes.
Sure.
No, but to me it was mainly, and that was true of your mother as well. We just had such great enjoyment being parents, and of course part of that is a tremendous help is having a good partner in the affair, like your mother was. But just having a father and a mother and a grandparents like that helped me tremendously in learning myself and growing into be a father myself.
You alluded to in the story about grandfather about the importance of his presence and the presence that he carried and the dignity he carried. How important is presence for a father, or the presence of being a father and being present in actually the child's life?
To me, Ben, that's the most crucial thing in growing up and becoming a mature adult yourself and becoming a parent, is to simply having been to grow up and to live with people like my mom and dad were, and like my grandparents were. And through the years, as I began to study more about, working as a pastor, and I tried to learn as much as I could about human dynamics, and one of the authors I found tremendously helpful was a man by the name of Dr. Edwin Friedman, who was, I believe he's now deceased, but he was both a Jewish rabbi. He had his own Jewish congregation, but he was also a practicing psychiatrist. And he wrote a book called Generation to Generation, which I found incredibly helpful in understanding the dynamic of relationships. And I began understanding much better how my own parents had influenced and shaped my life. And then later on, he wrote a book of fables. He thought much teaching came through fables. And I just came across one the other day that struck me as very apropos for my understanding of my own father. He calls the fable Panic. And it's a little story about dominoes. You know how you set dominoes up on end in a line, and then you hit one, and eventually it knocks all of them over. And he talks about these dominoes and how each domino, he gives the dominoes a personality. And each domino tried very hard as it saw its neighbor beginning to topple to try to prop its neighbor up. But they all failed until eventually it came to one domino who was not tipped over. And that's where the process of falling of the dominoes stopped. Well, all the other dominoes had been knocked over, rushed up to this one domino and asked him, how in the world did you do that? What was your plan? And he said, I'm not sure what the difference was in me, said the domino who had not been dominoed. All I can say is that while each of you kept trying to hold your neighbor up, my concern was that I did not go down. My dad was that domino. He stood firm no matter what happened around him, no matter what conditions were, no matter what other people's ideas or expressions might have been. He stood like a rock. He held firmly to his family or his life values and his belief system. He described himself, as people often did then, believing Christians as people of the book. He was a man who lived the scriptures. And that just had a tremendous impact in my own formation, living with a man like that. And of course, again, I'd have to say my mother was involved, but in a very different kind of way.
Last night, Laura and I were attending an event for the new senior chiefs, the senior enlisted people at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and the keynote speaker said something that your comment just reminded me of that. He said, he called it when you got to that rank, you were in the corporate Air Force now. You had to watch, you had to dress right, you had to show up on time, and you had to lead by example. If you wanted your troops out there on the line early, you had to be there. If you wanted them staying late, you had to be there. But basically, he lived the example that he wanted people to emulate, and it sounds like that's what Grandpa was doing for you.
That's exactly it. And I've long believed, Ben, that what children, beyond the basic obvious necessities of food and shelter and health care and education, all the things that are obvious, what children really need beyond that is to grow up with adults, true mature adults around them. I had that enormous blessing of growing up with adults. And when your mom and I married, that's one of the things she and I agreed on, that we were going to try to become that kind of adult that would enable you and your brothers to also grow up and become strong, independent-minded young men, who had your own lives and values, and could go out and live your own lives in a very successful way.
One of the changes, I guess, from that time to now that we're finding is more and more, and I'll use the word broken families, where you had the advantage, my brothers and I had the advantage of a complete family, mom, dad, supportive community. So often now you have single fathers and single mothers out there, and they don't necessarily have the benefit of that additional support infrastructure. What would be your thoughts for those folks? I mean, literally, you talk about being the domino. They have to be the domino in this case.
Right. Well, one of the things I see changing now is that there's more growing interest and more studies being done in relationship to the role of the father in the family. And I was delighted, for example, this morning to see in the Parade magazine, what came with the Daily Star, a photograph of Michael Strahan, football player, with his children, and it's just pure joy, and that just made my heart glad to see a father like that enjoying his children. And then in the Star itself, on the front page, there's an article about a growing trend of men, especially young men, who are volunteering to serve as foster fathers. Yeah. And I think this is just a tremendous program. I'm so delighted that that's happening. So my suggestion, we need to stop now.
Go ahead. You got a few seconds.
Is for single parents to find other mentors like that who can fill that gap for them.
Okay, folks, I'm here with my dad talking about Father's Day and fatherhood. Hey, listen, next week, don't forget to tune in. We'll be joined by one of the nation's top youth motivational speakers. He's known as the Climber Guy. He uses rock climbing and outdoor adventures to teach about improving personal performance, goal setting, and achievement. This guy, his name is John Beatty. He's an author. We're catching him just before he literally gets on a plane to go to Indonesia. This is a guy who did the hokey pokey in the middle of a hurricane. Don't miss next week. But stay tuned right now. I'll be back with my dad, Bill Buehler, right here on Daily Mail. That's some cool jazz. I like that. Silent Jim, our producer. Folks, this is your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia. Welcome back to Daily Mail on Father's Day. My guest today grew up on a farm during the Depression, literally one-room schoolhouse. Paid for his college education by working the railroads up in the wilderness of Alaska. Kind of funny joke there. And basically spent his life going around the world helping people. And I'll tell you what, probably in my mind, his greatest achievement is that he's my dad. Welcome back, Dad, to Daily Mail.
Thank you, Ben. And I share that assessment with you. I've believed all my life, and I believe very firmly today, that the single greatest task that any human being can engage in, no matter what else you do in life, maybe with few exceptions, if you became president of the United States, that maybe would be a bigger task, but I think the most significant task, because it is essentially a sacred task, is a task of being a parent. And I've always considered that a great honor and a great joy. And I've always been grateful for my own parents, and I give thanks to God every day for them.
Well, I tell you, folks, please, if you haven't already, pick up the phone now, break away from the radio, call your dad, send him a note. Hopefully, go visit him, thank him for what, it's not easy. Life is not supposed to be easy, but being a parent, being a dad, can be a challenge, but we're all here because of our dad. So, Dad, kind of moving forward, just sort of your observations on life and fatherhood. You mentioned something about 2 or 3 is better than 50, and the rules.
Let's talk about rules. Part of parenting is, to set boundaries, to set limits. And by the way, there was an excellent article in the Star today from our own chief of police.
Chief Villasenor,
Villasenor, about, I really enjoyed that, and his focus was on working with your family, your children, to avoid the issues of drugs, which is such a plague today. And I'm really grateful to see, and his assessment of how important both father and mother are in setting those kinds of boundaries for their children. I've worked throughout my entire life with a lot of families, and one of the things I've seen that parents often make a mistake is and become very stressed out is they have a lot of rules. And one of the things I've often said to parents who are struggling with that is, look, and then they have 50 rules, and you can't enforce that many rules. So what I would say to parents is, hey, look, pick 2 or 3 important rules, and then enforce them. And how do you enforce them? Simply by being an adult, by being insistent, by being consistent, insisting that your children fall in line with those rules. In my own family, we had very few rules. One was when Mom called for a meal, we were to be there at the table and with our hands washed.
Yes.
I mean, people were aware of sanitation, and one of the reasons for that is the table really was kind of a sacred place, and it always began with prayer, Thanksgiving, and then it became a place where we really were, more than any other place in our family life, we were a family. I mean, everybody fit, everybody belonged, everybody was appreciated. Beyond that, we didn't have a lot of rules. And most of our instruction, Dad seldom said to us, do this or don't do that. He showed, as you said, by example, how he lived. Mom, the same way. And I remember when my brothers and I became adolescents, and of course, the vast majority of adults at that time were smokers. And, all our neighbors, I mean, not the women, but the men smoked. And my dad did not, but everybody else did. Well, my dad knew that we were at the age where we were going to start experimenting with that stuff. And my brother Bob and I actually did, the joke about using corn silk. We actually tried that. I don't know where we got the papers, but you go, whenever you wanted to hide from your parents, the saying was you went behind the barn. I mean, the barn was a big
in your
deal.
case, literally.
Literally.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a very successful experiment. But my dad one day, after we had finished dinner, I think, called us into we always ate in the kitchen. That was kind of doubled as a family room. But then he took us into the formal dining room. And that's where you kind of had family conference and so forth. And he called my brothers in there, and he said to us, now, you boys maybe are thinking of trying to smoke. And he says, that's okay with me, but he said, I want you to do one thing. If you start smoking, he said, you bring your cigarettes in here, and we'll sit around the table and we'll smoke together. And, that was not a rule. That was a way of showing us how life and how the structure of a family functioned. And I don't believe from that point on, neither my brothers or I ever thought again about smoking.
And why is that?
I can't really put my finger on it exactly, but part of it was, I can actually, because smoking became, what would you say? That was a signal of becoming a man, of an adult. I mean, you see it in the movie. You saw it in the movies all the time. You still kind of do, guys, and who was the famous male actor that was so popular? He'd have a cigarette kind of dangling, just kind of caught on the edge of his lip, sort of hanging there. And I think every young man that I knew aspired to grow up.
Oh, James Dean.
James Dean, yeah. To smoke like that, because then you were not only a man, you were a tough guy. Well, when my dad said, let's come and sit at the table and smoke together with your dad as a family, it just blew that right out of the water. You know? It's like,
so much for the rebellion thing, right?
Right, yeah, so much. Yeah, he just took rebellion right away from us. I know he never studied psychology, but dang, my mom and dad sure were smart.
Yeah, well, how old do you have to get before you realize that? I figured it out pretty early. Well, talking about rules a little bit, one of the things that has always impressed me about you and Mom both was your courage. I mean, you're a farm boy from South Dakota. Most of your peers, your family didn't leave that country unless they were shipped off to war, but you packed up and went to another country. You and Mom together. And I think that one of the things that has always impressed me is the stories you've shared is the recognizing the differences in the world and being able to adjust and adapt to that. And in particular, you and Mom spent some time in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. Always impressed me. When you retired, you sold everything you owned and packed a suitcase and went to a country you'd never been before. You didn't speak the language, but you went to Prague to teach. And you've often commented about how the rules in Praha, as they call it, were so much more different than here.
Well, right. We got there just at the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, and one of the things that happened, in their school system is quite different than ours, very formal, much like the Brit and other European systems, and among other things, they knew you needed languages, and so in addition to their own language, they always had one primary second language. Well, under the Soviet Union, of course, that was Russian. Well, with the Russians leaving, the teachers, there was a committee set up with parents and teachers and students, and it was hands down the second language was now going to be English. Mm-hmm. And so they then decided they wanted to call in native English speakers, so there was a number of us there, your mom and I and another American, 2 or 3 Brits, an Irishman that none of us could understand. Well, at the beginning of the school year, and I had this classroom where not many of the students spoke English, but one girl had studied in Oxford, England, and her English was excellent, so she helped me a lot as my interpreter, and of course I had only a few words of Czech. Well, they drew up a new set of rules for, the rules of conduct for the whole staff and students. And so one morning this girl brought me the set of rules to ask my opinion about them. They were 3 legal-sized pieces of paper, typewritten, both sides. Oh, there were literally, I think, close to 200 rules there, and they wanted to know what my opinion was. I looked at them, I crumpled them up and threw them in the wastebasket, and they cheered. Well, we're running out of time, but I'd like to continue that in the next segment because there's another part of it that really, I think, illustrates what I'm saying about the whole business of rules.
Okay, that's a deal. Folks, this is your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia. I'm joined on Father's Day by my dad, my pop. He's a cool kid. He Facebooks, he texts. But a lot of wisdom here, folks. We got one segment left. I hope you're enjoying it. You can still give us a call if you like, 751-1041. We'll be right back. Rock and roll. I got the cool dad. Yep, I do. Welcome back, folks. This is your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia. We're talking Father's Day with the foremost expert that I know on fatherhood, my very own dad. Dad, welcome back. We're talking a little bit about, it kind of made me smile. You're talking about rules, and over in Praha, or Prague, as Americans would refer to it, the 6 rules, or the Praha 6, I think you finished that story there. Yeah. They typed up just as 3 sheets of rules, and you crumpled them up and threw them in the trash.
Right, and all my students cheered. And then now the system there was very different. The classroom belonged to the students, and so as a teacher, you would go from room to room to meet each of your classes. Well, the practice was the students would all be in their desks, and then the teacher would come into the room, and they would stand until the teacher. The first morning I went into the classroom and I motioned for all of them to sit down, and they wouldn't sit down. I'm thinking, like, what am I doing wrong? Then finally the girl who spoke English said, well, you need to sit down first, Mr. Buehler, and then we'll sit down. So I talked to them then about, okay, what rules did we want to have? And finally we agreed that we would have one single rule, and that was to respect each other. And I'll tell you what, I had 120-some students, seniors, all of them seniors. In that entire year, I never once had even the slightest, remotest hint of a problem, a behavioral problem in that class with those young people. They were just marvelous. And I finally agreed they still wanted to stay with standing up when I came into the room, and I said, well, that would be all right with me if we agreed that it wasn't just to honor me, but it was to honor the whole process of education, and they liked that idea. But that's, going back to what I say to parents often, have 2 or 3 rules that you really believe in, that are crucial, and then stick to them. Don't have 50 rules and not enforce them. That's devastating.
Right. One of the things that I just observing, I'm not a father, but just as society, the distinction between when you were growing up and learning from life examples or from interacting directly with fathers or with parents, whereas nowadays there seems to be sort of an instant desire for just add water, or I'm going to read one book, or join this movement, and someone will show me, I can learn in 30 seconds or less how to be a better parent. Do you think has that been helpful or hurtful, or, are parents trying too hard, maybe, is I guess the way I'd put it?
Yeah, that's really the other side of the coin. They desire to be a good parent, but there's been such a movement in, learning how to do things in all areas, and that certainly is true of parenting. And there's all kinds of books and tapes and seminars and on and on and on, and encouraging people to be good parents. And in some ways, many of the parents I've dealt with through the years are trying too hard. One of my memories of that is sitting in church one evening after choir practice, and a woman who was raising, interestingly enough, 3 sons just like I was very troubled because she was having a lot of trouble with her sons, and she was quite uptight about it and very stressed. And she and I, remember, sat down on the steps in front of the altar, and we were talking with each other. We were side by side, and she just was literally crying. And I'm looking at her, and I really didn't know what to say. What could I say to this woman to kind of alleviate her distress? I happened to look down at her hands, and I noticed that her hands were just clenched tight, and I realized that her entire body was rigid. And I just reached down and took took a hold of the hand that was beside me, and I just gradually, gently opened up her fingers and rubbed her hand and had her relax her hand, and then her whole body relaxed. Now, she was a very, very intelligent woman, I should say is, and she looked at me and smiled because she knew instantly the message in that single act, that she needed to relax and stop trying so hard. And from that moment on, her parenting changed. And she, when they're little, your kids don't need best buddies. They've got buddies in school, wherever else. What they need is an adult. If you do it right, if you raise them right, they become your friends when they grow up. And Ben, one of the great joys for me in my life is to count you and your brothers as my best friends in this world. But it's, the basic thing we need to understand is, as parents, we cannot be all things at all times for our children. Be the things that really count. Be an adult for them. Be there for them. Be the rock that can help them. And I would often come to say to parents, look, there's only a couple things we can really do for our children, beyond, of course, the basics that are obvious. We can love them. They need to be loved. And I've always found women are generally speaking, better at this than men, the unconditional love. My mom she never had a stranger in her home. It didn't make any difference who came to her home. They were welcomed as part of the family. That unconditional love. Your mom was that way. And every father is greatly blessed who has a partner like that, or who's had a mother like that. And so children need to be loved in that way, accepted, cherished. And then the other thing I think we can do for our kids is pray for them. If we have enough time, I'd like to share a story of my own mother about that. You know your grandmother. She was socially very adept and yet quite a shy person, and she very seldom, if ever, spoke like in a public meeting or something. And I remember one year in a family reunion, she stood up after a meal and she said, "There's something I want to say to all of you." And you know, my brothers and sisters and I, we were just looking at each other and saying, "This is our mom, this is so unlike her." Yeah. And she started telling us, and she said, "I want you all to know that from the time each of you were born." Now, I knew my mother was a very devout Christian woman, and that was real for her. There was nothing hypocritical about either of my parents. I mean, they were real in their faith. And she said, "From the day each of you were born, I prayed for each of you by name every single day of your life from that moment to this moment." And it was like a light came on inside of me. I suddenly understood where my own deep thirst for knowing God and being close to God had originated. It had come. That was a spiritual gift from my mother. And spiritual gifts are always invisible and always silent. But as they are they can be transmitted, especially from parents to their children. And that's one of the gifts that was transmitted to me from my mother. And there is not a day, there's not a moment in my life, Ben, that goes by that I'm not grateful to my mother for that.
Wow, that's good. Yeah, that's good stuff. Thank you, Dad. That's very true. What I keep coming back to this idea, and something you mentioned before just struck me, because Laura's an animal behaviorist, and I'm watching her work. I'm learning that very often when someone is working with animals, it's not so much about teaching the animals, it is about teaching the human. But something you said struck me, and I see a parallel in her work, is that very often the animal wants to be led. They're looking for that alpha dog in this case, maybe. And something you said struck me very interesting about kids and parents. And when we became friends, when you and I became friends, that moment in my life that I trace that back to was when I went to college. And you and I began corresponding, but not as father-son, more man-to-man sort of correspondence. That was the transition for me. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think that needs to be emphasized very strongly, is that children need a parent, not beyond just a provider.
Absolutely. They need a parent, and the word I always use is adult. One of the words I often used in working with families was, I'd get the whole family in there, and parents and kids would be talking, and you could see the dysfunction. And one of the questions I would come to ask is, okay, who's the adult here? Or who are the adults?
And hopefully they had the answer.
Well, it's interesting how often people would kind of wake up and realize that they needed to grow up. Yeah, children do not need you as a buddy when they're little. That if you do the parenting right and everything turns out okay and you're really blessed, they'll turn out to be your buddy when they're grown up. You become, as you say, friends. For me, there was an exact parallel in my own life with my own dad. My dad was a pretty stern guy. I mean, he was a very strong, stern man. And I kind of was a little nervous sometimes around him. But I'd gone away to college, and my brothers had both been drafted. They were both in the military. And that summer I came home to work with my dad. Of course, summer was always a huge, intense time of planting and harvesting. And my brothers wanted us to be able to do that because we had a lot of rented land. They didn't want to lose it. Mm-hmm. And so my dad and I just worked our tails off that summer. And then in the evening, of course, the late evenings, we'd go out after supper and we'd sit on the cistern. There was kind of seat around it, and we'd visit with each other. And that's when I stopped being a child. I became an adult friend to my own father. And that was such a tremendous transition for me, and such a huge step in my own growing up, that I thought, now I can relate as an adult to my dad, and how tremendously I enjoy that of now, and he was very open, and my dad, in spite of being stern, was a very jolly kind of fella. He had a tremendous sense of humor, and he and I just had the best time that summer. And from that time on, he and I were incredibly close up until the very day of his death.
Well, Dad, thank you so much. I tell you, I would not be where I am today, and the strength that I feel, and mostly the confidence that I have in life is thanks to you and learning from your example, whether it was here in the States or in Mexico or on the reservation up in South Dakota. Thank you. Thank you for being my father.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for having me today.
I hope you enjoyed it, folks. What a great time I just had. I'm glad that you were listening and were able to share with us. Hey, tune in next week, beginning here at 1 o'clock on Daily Mail. We've got one of the nation's top youth motivational speakers, known as the Climber Guy. He's a rock climber. He's a mountain climber. This guy actually did the hokey pokey in the eye of a hurricane. John Beatty will be live with us, calling in just before he heads off to climb another mountain in Indonesia, right here on Daily Mail. Don't forget, American Warrior starts on Sundays beginning at noon. Next week, we're talking the U.S. Army and their birthday. Folks, thank you so much for your time. This has been your host, Ben Buehler-Garcia, along with my dad,